Which of the Falcons' big three skill players will be the next Julio Jones as the centerpiece of their offense?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, these sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I've been covering the Falcons for a lifetime, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers that make it your first listen, your first watch each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are talking all about the big three skill position players here in Atlanta: Bijan Robinson, Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and whether or not any of them can become the Julio Jones, so to speak, that this Zac Robinson-led offense can lean on heavily in year one. And, I'm going to start beginning to do some research on offenses under first-year offensive coordinators and, what level of success we can expect under this year one, sort of what's typical. And, I can't help but think back to, when the Falcons had a first-year offensive coordinator that came in with a lot of hype, and that was Kyle Shanahan way back in 2015, and how the Falcons offense started off pretty strong that year, with a top five sort of unit as part of their 5-0 start that season. And, not only was that start facilitated by good play calling from Kyle Shanahan back in 2015, but I think a lot of it, especially in the first three games, was facilitated by Julio Jones's dominance that season. And, it makes me wonder if sort of that singular sort of performance of having that sort of elite player is necessary. And time will tell when I start doing the research of that. But it makes me wonder, if this season in the Falcons, with the toughness of their schedule over the first, several, weeks and or months of the season, if they're going to get through that and win those games, who's going to be that guy in this year's offense that could potentially be that guy that's the sort of dominant force in their offense. And, I do tend to think that regardless of whether or not you have a first-year coordinator like the Falcons have in Zac Robinson, or, someone that's in their 10th year as the coordinator, that most of the best offenses in the NFL, there is a trend where there seems to have that sort of foundational player, where basically every week defensive coordinators and defensive players are like, we got to stop this guy, right? They know who's going to get the ball, and they're essentially powerless to stop it. And that often manifests in sort of having that sort of skill position player that, often gets 1,500 or more yards a season. And, whether that's a Christian McCaffrey, whether that's an Amon-Ra St. Brown, a CeeDee Lamb, a Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Travis Kelce, Jamar Chase, or in the Rams case, under Sean McVay, that began as Todd Gurley, then kind of transformed into Cooper Kupp, and this past year that was Puka Nacua. Or in the case of some teams that have top offenses that don't really necessarily have that singular skill position player, like Baltimore, they have Lamar Jackson, who can kind of function not only as the quarterback that facilitates the ball to the very skill position players, but he's the guy that, his mobility and whatnot is the thing that you're going to stop. And when I talk about a foundational player, that's kind of the foundation of your offense. That's the sort of bedrock that it's laid upon, which is, hey, everybody knows who's going to get the football, but you can't stop them. You can only hope to contain them. And, you've heard me refer to in the past, if you've been an everydayer of this podcast for several years now, I've often referred to Julio Jones back in the day as the sun, right? That, that's where most of the gravity in the solar system belongs, right? Everything revolves around him. And that's what I mean, where you have a foundational player. And we're going to talk a little bit more on today's episode about each of the big three in Bijan, Drake, and Kyle. We're all on a first name basis with all these guys. And it's the question of, in the future, not only this year, but in the future, will the Falcons offense be one of these top offenses because they have a player of similar caliber as some of these aforementioned players, including Julio Jones? And which of these players are best positioned to become that player? And, one of those players that may, I won't say is the best bet, but is a guy that I think is at the core of that conversation is Bijan Robinson in the run game, and whether or not this run game is going to be that sort of thing that teams gear up to stop this upcoming season. And some of that depends on Bijan Robinson. Some of that depends on the offensive line, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, I want to tell you that summertime is great for a lot of things, like cookouts and whatnot, but not so much when it comes to sports because, playoffs are pretty much done. We're getting fewer games. Baseball's still going strong, but the sports aren't sporting like we want them to, right? And FanDuel's here to kind of keep the party going because this summer they're hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just head over to FanDuel.com and make the most of your summer. If you want to bet on how many yards Bijan's going to have this year, he has the 8th best odds, according to FanDuel, to lead the NFL in rushing yards. His over-under is 925. Kyle Pitts has the 5th best odds among tight ends, but there's like 40 receivers ahead of him, including Drake London, who has the 10th best odds to lead the NFL in receiving yards. Over-under for Drake London is 1,000 yards. Kyle Pitts is 750 yards. So head on over to FanDuel. If some of these, bets are a little intriguing to you, and make the most out of your summer. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Guys, I want to tell you about Locked On Sports Today, a 24/7 streaming sports channel program for you each and every day to bring you the big stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. And if you're looking for more local flavor, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, one of the things that I plan on doing this summer in the next couple of days and weeks and probably months leading up to the season is, I'm going to start looking at, film of NFL players. Like we're almost done with the draft prospects film. I'll probably be done with Zion Logan in the next day or two. And hopefully we'll be breaking down him and Casey Washington by the end of this week. But, the Rams offense is going to be one of the offenses I study in earnest this year. And, I am of the opinion, and we'll see if my opinion changes, after I sit down and watch the film in the coming days and weeks. But I think a lot of people look at sort of Zac Robinson and sort of looking at what type of offense the Falcons are going to have here, porting over from Sean McVay's offense, is they're looking at some of the recent offenses under, Matt Stafford, right? And I tend to think that we're more likely to see these sort of Jared Goff-led offenses, a Falcons offense in 2024 that resembles more the Jared Goff-led offenses than the Stafford-led Rams offenses, just because I think that is a better match for what type of personnel the Falcons are bringing to the table. Like you have a quarterback in Kirk Cousins that to me is much closer to Jared Goff in terms of his, strength and talents, and, play action passing being a core part of their offense than Matt Stafford, right? You have an offensive line that's built around the outside zone run scheme, where in recent years the Rams have sort of shifted away from the outside zone and more into a sort of a power downhill run scheme, right? We've talked a little bit in the past about how everybody's sort of expecting the Falcons to sort of spam 11 personnel or 3 wide receiver sets like the Rams have consistently under Sean McVay. But I think we're going to see a lot more 12 personnel than people are expecting, with Kyle Pitts in the sort of Gerald Everett role and, Charlie Warner potentially in the Tyler Higbee role in the 2 tight end offense that we saw the Rams operating in 2019 and 2020. And then probably the biggest point of comparison is the Bijan Robinson to Todd Gurley comparison. And I asked Jarvis Davis I think a week or two ago on the podcast about, sort of the parallels between Bijan and Gurley and whether or not Bijan had the potential to put up numbers similar to what Todd Gurley did in those early years under Sean McVay when he was kind of the foundational piece of that offense and wasn't, not necessarily MVP candidate because we know running backs can only win the MVP if they rush for 2,000 yards, but was an offensive player of the year sort of candidate. And I think the potential for Bijan to be that type of playmaker for this Falcons offense this year or in the future is definitely there. Now, when a lot of people look at Bijan's rookie season as a little bit of a disappointment, and I certainly think there are things that Bijan can improve upon, like ball security and route running, and be a better player in year two. But I think a lot of the sort of negative feelings surrounding Bijan's production last year and debut season are based around too much hype and or too much ignorance when it comes to Bijan Robinson. The hype, and I'll die on this hill, but I think too often with rookies, especially, we don't pay enough attention to floors of players when they enter the NFL. And I think a lot of people hyped up Bijan to be the next Christian McCaffrey, not really realizing that Christian McCaffrey wasn't even Christian McCaffrey, especially in his first year in the NFL. And then I think the ignorance comes from people assuming that he'd get all the carries last year, not really understanding that Arthur Smith has consistently operated a two-headed backfield in all his years in Atlanta, and that wasn't going to change. But I think when it comes to Bijan's potential, it's less about Bijan, it's more about the infrastructure around Bijan, because we know Bijan has the capability of being a high-level player, and we saw flashes of that last year. But the reason why he didn't do that every week is not because Bijan lacks the ability to do that, but the infrastructure around him wasn't that. And we've discussed this ad nauseum for 9 months, but like the Falcons were making a big bet on their run game, the preeminence of the run game, I guess you could say, that didn't quite live up to expectations in that regard, right? If you look at success rate, rushing efficiency, they were 24th last year. If you look at expected points added per rush, they were 28th. If you look at rushing DVOA, they were 22nd. And so all these quote unquote advanced stats show you that the Falcons were essentially a bottom 10 run team. And yet, like, every time I see someone talk about or rank the Falcons offensive line like it was a top 5 unit, I throw up a little bit in my mouth, because I'm just like, that does not mesh at all with reality. And that's not because, the run game wasn't performing so poorly because Bijan or the running backs. It was mostly because the offensive line did not live up to expectations. We talked about this a ton throughout last season, and we've talked about it a ton this offseason. And I think the hope for the Falcons run game is going to be that they bounce back, right? That we saw that type of unit in 2022. We didn't see that type of unit in 2023. And basically what I'm saying is they have to bounce back, right? Because, if Bijan's going to be that sort of foundational piece of your offense, instead of an offensive line in a run game that ranks 24th in success rate and rushing efficiency, like they have to be 4th in rushing efficiency, like the 49ers under Christian McCaffrey, who's probably the one sort of foundational running back today, right? Derrick Henry was that player a couple of years ago, but today you would say Christian McCaffrey is probably, the top dog in that regard. And the 49ers were 3rd in success rate last year. And so I think when it comes to the offensive line specifically, it's, I think the right side is fine. I think it's really about the left side, right? I don't think Bergeron, I don't think Jake Matthews as run blockers really came anywhere close to performing at the level that they should have last year. And so that part of the offensive line is going to have to be significantly better this upcoming season. But, if I'm, while I'm skeptical of, whether or not this offense is going to make the leaps that they need to, I think they have to, right? Especially in the run game. And it's really about the offensive line more so than it is Bijan Robinson. That, like, I don't think they can make the playoffs without a massive leap from this run game, is basically what I'm saying. And I think the offensive line is sort of the unit that's under the crosshairs. And again, I understand why people buy the hype on the Falcons offensive line, because again, we're 2 years ago, they were a top 5 unit, at least as far as the run blocking is concerned. But we haven't seen that since. And we need to see that again this year. And so I think there's reasons to be optimistic when it comes to the run game, and Bijan sort of living up to the hype of being that sort of foundational player that can be the Todd Gurley but like that's a core part of the Rams' success was, a big part of why the Rams sort of turn things around, and again, we'll do more research on this, but, my general feeling is the Rams offensive line in 2017 with the upgrades they made with guys like Andrew Whitworth and John Sullivan, and I'm sure other names that I'm blanking on, to me was a big part of why that McVay offense worked so effectively for so many years. And, the previous versions of the Rams offense didn't work. And so that's why, like, to me, like, I've said this before with Arthur Smith's offense, and it will be interesting to see if this also proves true under Zac Robinson. But to me, the Falcons offense went the way that the offensive line went. Like the Arthur Smith's offense was basically predicated by line play. And, I can't help but notice, like in Pittsburgh, they drafted 3 offensive linemen. And I'm like, that's a good strategy if Arthur Smith is going to be your guy for the foreseeable future. So we'll see how that plays out for them. But, it'll be interesting to see if it's a similar thing with Zac Robinson where, he can overcome, an underperforming offensive line, or, is his offense spearheaded by an overperforming offensive line, which we would love to see. So that is going to be a big question this upcoming season, if the offensive line can bounce back. But, we got 2 other sort of skill position players that are going to be a big part of the passing game. And we'll talk about, Drake London's potential to be that sort of true blue number 1 receiver that we really haven't had since, Calvin Ridley in the back half of 2020 or Julio Jones in 2019 and in previous years, as well as, Kyle Pitts' potential to be that sort of elite number 1 sort of tight end that can be the foundation of your offense, that rare sort of tight end. And we'll break that down, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Passion, drive, patience. It is the formula for winning championships. And it's also what's going to keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. I know they got me covered with my seatbelt covers that should be coming in the next week or two from eBay Motors. And they have over 122 million parts for your number 1 ride or die. And you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guarantee Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guarantee Fit only available to U.S. customers. So let's wrap up today talking about the passing game. And we spent a considerable amount of time on this podcast over the offseason talking about Drake London's potential to be the Puka Nacua or the Cooper Kupp in this offense, right? To be that breadwinner, the guy that's getting 10 or more targets on average each and every week. And, that's kind of the core to the foundational player conversation that we're having on today's episode, which is like, everybody knows who's going to get the ball, right? You played the Rams last year. It's like Puka Nacua is going to get the football. We got to stop him. Previous years it was Cooper Kupp is going to get the football. We got to stop him. And the hope is that, similar to the conversation we were having about Julio Jones and hopefully Drake London, is like, everybody knows who's going to get the football. You just got to stop him. Now, I don't think Drake London's from a talent standpoint is on the Julio Jones level or the Tyreek Hill level. But, we can still expect Zac Robinson's offense to figure out ways to get involved, just like Sean McVay's offense was able to get the ball to guys like Nacua and Kupp, who aren't on the same level as Julio and Tyreek Hill from a talent standpoint when we talk about those sort of foundational players at the top of the league. But, you can use things like motion to create advantageous matchups that are going to sort of break the rules of defenses and their coverage shells. And we've discussed that previously on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. And that's going to be one of the things that when I'm studying the Rams offenses, I'll be focusing on their use of motions to create those sort of mismatches and other ways that they were able to feature their number 1 guys, even if they weren't just simply asking Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp to just line up and beat the guy in front of them, as the Falcons so often did with Julio Jones and teams that have had, Tyreek Hill on their offense, like Miami and Kansas City, ask him to do. Stephon Diggs, another player like that. But, I think Drake has to kind of be that guy for the Falcons, just because the rest of the Falcons wide receiver core leaves a little bit desired. And I know others are higher on guys like Darnell Mooney and Rondale Moore and Ray McLeod than I am, which is fine, but it's not that I think those guys are bad or anything. I just think they're complementary players, that they're in the same vein as players like, Mac Hollins and Mohamed Sanu and Harry Douglas and Russell Gage, et cetera, that are complementary weapons that when you put them next to number one wide receivers like that Sanu and Douglas were opposite Julio Jones, or Mac Hollins was in 2022 when he was playing opposite Devontae Adams, like, yeah, that's a perfectly fine number two in those situations. But if you don't have that number one guy that's, in the conversation for being one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, they leave a lot to be desired as number twos. And, when we think about high-end number two wide receivers, at least in top passing offenses, it's players like Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith and Calvin Ridley, and at least Calvin Ridley in Atlanta, Deebo Samuel in San Francisco, Chris Godwin. That's not the tier I would put Darnell Mooney or Rondale Moore in. However, that's probably the tier of receiver that I would put Drake London in. And so the question with Drake London is, can we get more than a guy that would be a high-end number two in a high-powered passing offense? Can we get a number one receiver in a high-powered passing offense? And that's what is going to allow Drake to go from wherever he is right now to that sort of foundational piece. And clearly the potential is there. We'll see if he lives up to the potential, or will, people be sitting here 3 years from now complaining about the Falcons not having that guy because, they passed on Rome Odunze and he could have been that guy. And he's that guy, in 2027 for the Bears, while Drake London falls short. Then, speaking of people complaining about draft picks, let's talk about Kyle Pitts. And when we talk about foundational tight ends that are that guy that you have to gear up to stop, there's really only one guy, that's Travis Kelce. And even at the peak of Kelce's powers, like Tyreek Hill is probably the main guy for the Chiefs offense. But we did see once they moved on from Tyreek Hill in 2022, Kelce kind of step into that role. He didn't maintain that last year, in part due to injuries, and also the Chiefs offense was pretty middling last year. But it sort of begs the question on whether a tight end can be a foundational piece to your offense, right? I think it's possible, but there isn't a ton of precedent for it in the NFL. You have guys like Kelce, you've seen moments where Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Darren Waller, Rob Gronkowski, for a span of games or maybe a season or two, be that guy, but nothing really long-term that you can build an entire offense around in the ways that I think a lot of people envisioned for Kyle Pitts when we initially drafted him. But, I know it's not always fair to frame it this way, but I think when it comes to the conversation with Kyle Pitts, often it's people are way more invested in the pick living up to the hype as opposed to the player that is Kyle Pitts. Meaning that, like, he needs to be this sort of foundational player so that he lives up to the draft pick capital that we use on him, rather than he needs to be a player good enough to help the team win football games, which doesn't require him being that sort of foundational piece. And it goes back to a conversation we had last week on the podcast, I believe last Wednesday, about, Pitts and whether or not he's going to live up to the hype of the pick. And a listener basically said, if he isn't on Kelce's level, we whiffed on that draft pick. And I pushed back against that idea, mostly because I don't think Pitts has to be, TE1 or TE2 on Kelce's level to help the Falcons win football games. He can be the sixth or seventh best tight end in the NFL and still help the Falcons win a ton of football games. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's the thing I care about. But, I can't speak for everybody else out there. If you're super invested in, if you're losing sleep at night because of the 2021 draft selection, then, that's on you. But, they do have medicine for that. Therapy could also help as well. But we won't get into that. So, we've talked before about Pitts' expected changes in terms of his usage, more inline snaps, more underneath targets, and the latter being something that should increase his production this year. And, hopefully we'll see him get used kind of like another high-end tight end that's not necessarily a foundational player, which is T.J. Hockenson, but he was arguably the second best tight end in the NFL last year. And, there was a stretch of games last year where he was the number one target for the Vikings offense. There was like 6 weeks that Justin Jefferson was out of the lineup. But, with T.J. Hockenson, when you look at the bulk of his career outside of that stretch of games last year, he's probably been closer to TE6 than he has been to TE2. And there's also been, similar conversations around TJ Hockenson as being a quote unquote disappointment as a former top 10 pick, as we have with Kyle Pitts. Again, people are so invested in, the pick living up to the hype rather than, necessarily the guy helping you win football games. And T.J. Hockenson certainly helps you win football games. And that Vikings offense is going to be another offense that, I'm going to study because, Kirk Cousins was a part of that offense. Kevin O'Connell is a McVay disciple, similar to Zac Robinson. And there are certainly things I think that the Falcons can borrow from that Vikings offense and how they utilize T.J. Hockenson that could improve the ways that the Falcons have used Kyle Pitts under Zac Robinson's offense. So we'll see about that. So, with Pitts being foundational, I don't necessarily have those expectations due to, I think, it being harder for tight ends to be that guy. But if you can get him a step closer to that guy, then, that still benefits the Falcons. And even if none of these three guys are that sort of foundational Julio Jones level player, maybe you can argue the collective whole of them being closer to those guys, give you the similar benefit. Like, I just learned what the word gestalt means. And it's something along the lines of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And, we started this conversation talking about the 2015 Falcons with Julio, but maybe we can finish by talking about the 2012 Falcons with Julio as the main guy, but it was kind of a three-headed monster with Julio as 1A and Roddy being 1B and Tony Gonzalez being 1C. Right, that defenses still focus most of their game plan on Julio Jones just because they were afraid of the explosive potential that he could, gash them down the field. But you saw throughout that season, those three guys kind of take turns creating mismatches week to week, right? Like if we went up against an opponent that struggled to cover tight ends, okay, that was the week that Tony was going to eat above the other two. If the team had a subpar number 2 corner or something like that, then Roddy's going to eat on those one-on-ones. Now, it's not quite the same because you don't have 3 similar caliber weapons in the passing game, and you don't have that sort of dominant vertical threat like Julio was on the outside that's going to dictate coverages. You have guys that can make plays down the field in Kyle Pitts and Drake London, but they're not necessarily guys that are on the same level as Julio, which is like, defensive coordinators are, losing sleep each and every week being like, how do we stop this? But, I think there are some similar insights that you can apply to this 2024 offense from that 2012 offense, which is the idea of, defenses are probably going to game plan to gear up to stop the run game, right? They're going to stack the box. We'll probably see a lot of cover 3 for that reason. That's the main defense that we saw last year with opponents against the Falcons. And I think if we do see that maintained this year, that will open up opportunities for, the passing game via play action, which, is basically what the Goff and Gurley led Rams were, which was a strong run game under Todd Gurley and a play action heavy passing attack under Jared Goff with those various weapons that they had. And that led to a lot of success. And so, you can be that sort of team, I think, a lot easier if you have that sort of foundational piece to your offense. But even if you don't, the Falcons can make strides towards that. And I think that's really the goal of this upcoming season. So we'll see if the Falcons achieve that goal, but that's going to do it for us here. I'm sure we will be revisiting this topic many times over the coming weeks between now and the start of training camp and throughout training camp. Well, we're not going to spend too much time talking about practice on this podcast once training camp is good. We'll spend some time talking about practice, but that's not really where we're at. We're focused on the regular season, not the preseason, the exhibition season. So we'll see on that front. We have some Falcons historian shootouts to come your way later this week. Jonathan Babineau and I'm blanking on the other player. I always blank on who it is. John Abraham. That's who it is. So that will be in store for you later this week. We should hopefully also finish this week with some scouting reports on Casey Washington and Zion Logue. We might do Casey Washington tomorrow. That may be the plan tomorrow. So we'll see what's what. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen so you don't miss those episodes. And all you got to do to do that is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure you check out your second listens, Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every